Hulk Hogan laid to rest in an exclusive Florida funeral. Wrestling icon Hulk Hogan has been laid to rest in an emotional, private funeral service held in Florida. The ceremony was attended by his closest family, longtime friends, and select wrestling peers. As fans around the globe mourn the passing of the wrestling legend, this video takes you inside the emotional farewell to the man behind Hulkamania, Terry Bollea. From touching tributes by his children to heartfelt memories shared by wrestling veterans, this private service honored Hogan not just as an entertainer, but as a father, a friend, and a fighter. The Florida sun was unusually gentle that morning, as if the universe itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Palm trees stood solemn, swaying in silence, and a soft breeze whispered through the coastal town where the man known to millions as Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, was laid to eternal rest. It wasn't a public spectacle. It wasn't meant to be. This wasn't about the bright lights, the roaring arenas, or the Hulkamania chants that once defined an era. This was about closure, grief, and honoring the final chapter of a man who lived louder than life, but departed in a quiet, sacred farewell. The funeral was held at an exclusive, private estate just outside Clearwater, not far from where Hogan had spent the last years of his life. Security was tight. Media helicopters circled, but were pushed back. There were no fan chants, no pyro, no spotlights. Just grief. Real, raw, unfiltered grief. A grief that draped over those in attendance like a black veil, heavy and suffocating. The guest list was carefully curated. No press. No fanfare. Only those who truly knew the man behind the mustache were invited. His children, Brooke and Nick, were among the first to arrive. Brooke wore a simple black dress, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, yet the pain radiating from her was unmistakable. Nick looked like he hadn't slept in days. His steps were slow, almost reluctant, as though walking closer to the ceremony meant accepting the unbearable reality that his father was truly gone. The ceremony took place in a lush garden surrounded by tall oak trees, which cast long, protective shadows over the grieving guests. At the center stood a modest wooden casket adorned with a spray of yellow and red flowers, Hulk Hogan's iconic colors. Beside it rested a single pair of his wrestling boots, worn and cracked with age, placed there not as memorabilia but as a symbol. A symbol of every arena he'd ever electrified, every opponent he ever slammed, and every fan he ever inspired. There were no video montages, no flashy eulogies. Just stories. Stories that came from the heart and painted a portrait of a man far more complex than his wrestling persona ever allowed the world to see. Ric Flair spoke first. His voice cracked before he even reached the podium. He was larger than life. Not just in the ring, but in the way he loved. Flair began, eyes brimming with tears. We had our ups and downs, but damn it, we were brothers. Real brothers. I knew Terry, not Hulk. And Terry had a heart the size of that WrestleMania crowd in '87. Triple H, dressed in a sharply tailored black suit, followed with his own tribute. Hulk Hogan wasn't just a superstar. He created superstardom. Before The Rock, before Cena, before Roman, there was Hulk. He taught us what it meant to carry the company, to carry the business. But off camera, he was a mentor. He reached out to me when I was a rookie. Said, "Kid, if you want to make it here, you better learn to listen before you talk." I never forgot that. Then came Vince McMahon. Frail and visibly shaken, the former WWE chairman walked with the aid of a cane. His appearance was unannounced and unexpected, but not unwelcome. McMahon stood at the edge of the platform, gazing at the casket for a long moment before speaking. "We built an empire together," Vince said quietly. "And empires fall. But legacies endure." Terry wasn't perfect. None of us are. But he was real. He gave the world something to believe in. And for that, I will always be grateful. The most gut-wrenching tribute came from Brooke. She stood alone, trembling, holding a folded piece of paper. Her voice shook with every word. "My dad wasn't just Hulk Hogan. He was my superhero. When I was scared of monsters in the closet, he was there. When boys broke my heart, he was there. When I doubted myself, he reminded me to be strong, to fight, to never give up. Because that's what he did. Every single day. She paused to collect herself, and the silence was deafening. Not even birds chirped. Then she continued, whispering, people knew him as an icon. I knew him as Dad. And I miss him so much it hurts to breathe. Nick, her brother, didn't speak. He couldn't. But he placed his hand on the casket and stood in silence for several long minutes, as if trying to transfer all his love, all his pain, into the wood separating him from his father. Throughout the garden, grown men wept. Legends of wrestling who once slammed steel chairs over each other's heads now shared handkerchiefs and comforting embraces. Undertaker sat in the back, sunglasses hiding his expression, but his fingers clutched a single black rose, the same type of rose he left on pallbearer's grave years ago. A silent tribute from one legend to another. As the ceremony came to a close, the officiant, a longtime friend of Hogan's, spoke about redemption. About the human behind the hero. Terry wasn't a saint. But he tried. He struggled. He fell and got back up over and over again. That's what made him great. Not the wins. Not the fame. But the resilience. The final moment was the most haunting. A recording of Hulk Hogan's theme song, Real American, played softly through a hidden speaker. But it wasn't triumphant. It was slowed down, almost like a lullaby. The iconic lyrics, I am a real American, fight for the rights of every man, carried a different weight now. No longer an anthem of bravado, but a farewell to a warrior. One by one, guests approached the casket to say their last goodbyes. Randy Orton placed his father's old wrestling gloves beside the boots. John Cena bowed his head in prayer. Even The Rock, who had flown in quietly under the radar, stood silently with tears glistening in his eyes before gently placing a folded American flag across the casket. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the estate, Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, was finally laid to rest. The casket was slowly lowered into the earth, with Brooke and Nick throwing in handfuls of sand. The sound was unbearable. Final. Irrevocable. Like a chapter closing. Outside the estate gates, fans had gathered. Quietly. Respectfully. Some held candles. Others held signs. One simply read, Thank you, Hulk. Another, Legends never die. The world would remember the red and yellow. The flexed muscles. The leg drops. The ripped shirts and thunderous promos. But here, behind the gates, they remembered something more. They remembered Terry. A man who gave everything to the business and in doing so, became so much more than just a character on TV. Even in his final moments, Hogan had brought people together. Enemies became friends. Rivals embraced. And the wrestling world paused, truly paused, not for spectacle, but for grief. For reverence. For love. This wasn't just the end of a life. It was the end of an era. As the mourners slowly began to leave, the silence lingered in the garden like a respectful ghost. No one rushed. No one spoke louder than a whisper. It was as if the moment demanded reverence, demanded everyone pause and reflect. Not just on who Terry Bollea had been, but on what he had meant to the world around him. People hugged tightly. They cried freely. Some sat on the wooden benches placed around the garden, staring at the freshly filled grave as though waiting for the man himself to sit up, tear off his shirt one last time, and say, "What you gonna do when Hulkamania lives forever?" But there were no theatrics. Only quiet goodbyes. Later that evening, as the Florida sky turned from pink to a deep indigo, a small group of Hogan's closest friends and family gathered indoors for a more intimate remembrance. The room was lit with soft, golden lamps, casting a warm glow over framed photographs, championship belts, and mementos from decades of wrestling glory. One table displayed Hogan's first wrestling contract, yellowed and crinkled. Another featured his bandana, now framed behind glass, alongside a handwritten note to his children that simply read, "Always be strong." For each other. The room was filled with laughter through tears as stories began to unfold, stories not of the ring, but of real life. Of Hogan hosting impromptu BBQs for neighbors. Of him dressing up in full gear to surprise a sick child at a Tampa hospital. Of the time he accidentally crashed his boat into a dock and tried to fix it himself before admitting defeat and calling a repairman, all while wearing flip-flops and a tank top that read, "Still runnin' wild." One of the most moving stories came from Diamond Dallas Page, who recounted a dark period when Hogan had helped him privately through depression. "I was lost, man. Didn't know who I was anymore. And Hogan, Terry, he sat me down and said, 'Brother, your story ain't over. You're just in the dip. Ride it out. You're stronger than your worst day.'" I'll never forget that. Behind those words, behind the charisma, was a man who quietly held others up when they needed it. The world had only ever seen the surface. The catchphrases. The grandeur. But the real Terry Bollea was someone who carried the emotional weight of his mistakes, his regrets, and his responsibility to those who looked up to him. His past wasn't spotless, controversies had scarred his public image. But those who knew him personally never questioned his remorse, or the sincerity in his efforts to make amends. This evening wasn't about the scandals. It wasn't about headlines. It was about the man who tried, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, to live up to the ideals he'd once shouted from the rafters. To be a real American. To fight for what was right, and as much as this night was about mourning, it was also about forgiveness. A video message was played during the dinner, a compilation of fan submissions from around the world. Some wore old Hulkamania shirts. Others had the handlebar mustache drawn on. Many were children, smiling through their tears. But what stood out was the diversity. Fans from Japan, the UK, Mexico, Nigeria, India. All saying the same thing in different languages. "Thank you, Hogan." One little boy, no older than 6, looked directly into the camera and said, "When I'm scared at school, I pretend I'm Hulk Hogan and I'm not scared anymore." His innocence pierced the heart of everyone in the room. Sitting quietly in the corner of the room was Linda, Hogan's ex-wife. Time and heartbreak had changed their relationship, but on this night, all of that faded. She dabbed her eyes, watching her children grieve, and whispered softly, "He always loved them. No matter what happened. He never stopped loving them." Outside, the moonlight spilled onto the freshly laid grave. The air was still. There was a peace that blanketed the estate, as if the universe had given its blessing. This was the final bell. The 10-bell salute wasn't needed here. The silence was enough. Meanwhile, in the wrestling world, tributes poured in. WWE aired a special, In Memory, segment that evening on SmackDown, showing a slowed-down montage of Hogan's career, body slams, leg drops, and victorious poses atop the turnbuckles. But they also showed moments most had never seen, backstage clips of Hogan laughing with crew members, helping young wrestlers rehearse their promos, and offering quiet encouragement to those who struggled with the grind of the business. AEW followed suit, with Chris Jericho delivering a heartfelt message on live TV. "We stand in different arenas, but tonight, the entire wrestling world mourns together." Hulk Hogan broke down the doors that we now walk through. And whether you cheered him or booed him, you can't deny that he was the foundation. Impact Wrestling ran an old segment where Hogan gave a young fan his red and yellow bandana and hugged him for nearly a full minute. That child, now a grown man, posted the clip online with the caption, "He changed my life. He made me believe in heroes." Every corner of the internet was lit up with messages of grief and gratitude. Fans posted pictures with Hogan at meet and greets. Some shared letters they'd never sent. Others posted videos of themselves doing impressions, as if keeping the energy alive would somehow bring him back. Back at the Florida estate, as the evening wore on, guests began to leave one by one. Some kissed the framed photo on their way out. Some placed a hand on Brooke or Nick's shoulder, offering strength through silence. Paul "Big Show" White, who had arrived late due to a delayed flight, stood alone by the grave for nearly an hour. His massive frame hunched over, his eyes red. He murmured something no one could hear. Then he walked away, slowly, like a giant carrying the weight of the world. Even in death, Hulk Hogan brought people together, rivals, friends, family, and fans. Not for a match. Not for merchandise. But for memory. For mourning. For a final moment of unity in a world so often divided by storylines, politics, and egos, the final statement of the night came from Brooke herself. As the last of the guests departed, she returned to the grave alone and lit a single candle beside it. She whispered, "You told me to always be strong. I will. But I'll miss you forever." Then she walked away, letting the candle flicker in the darkness, like her father's legacy, glowing long after the man himself had faded, and somewhere, as that candle danced in the quiet wind, you could almost hear the faint echo of a voice, proud and full of life. What you gonna do when the spirit of Hulkamania runs wild in your heart? The days following Hulk Hogan's private funeral were marked by a global outpouring of emotion unlike anything seen in the wrestling world since the passing of legends like Dusty Rhodes or Macho Man Randy Savage. But this felt different. This was the death of a man who was professional wrestling to an entire generation. A man whose fame transcended arenas, whose face was plastered on lunchboxes and movie posters, whose voice had once narrated the very heartbeat of 1980s pop culture. It wasn't just a death. It was the end of a living symbol. Across the world, fans held candlelight vigils in his honor. In Tokyo, a group of veteran Japanese wrestlers held a special ceremony at Korakuen Hall, bowing in silence before a banner that read, "Thank you, Hulk Hogan." In London, thousands gathered at Trafalgar Square, holding up signs that read, "Rest in power, brother." In New York's Madison Square Garden, the site of some of Hogan's most legendary matches, the iconic video board displayed his silhouette with the words, "Forever the Immortal." Social media became a living memorial. Hashtags like #ThankYouHogan, #RestInPowerBrother, and #Hulkamania Forever trended for days. Tributes poured in from celebrities, athletes, and musicians. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson posted a lengthy video recalling how Hogan gave him his first big moment in WWE, calling him the bridge between legends and the future. In tears, he added, "No matter how high I climbed, I always knew who first opened the door for me." Snoop Dogg shared a video from his private collection, an unreleased freestyle session where Hogan jokingly tried to rap. "He had zero rhythm, man," Snoop laughed through tears. "But all heart. That was my dude." Even Hollywood took pause. Sylvester Stallone, who had cast Hogan as Thunderlips in Rocky III, shared a black and white still from the film with the caption, "You were always larger than life, and now you're larger than death. Rest easy, my friend." Back in Florida, Hogan's home became a temporary shrine. Fans left flowers, posters, bandanas, and action figures at the gate. Some wept openly, pressing their hands against the iron bars as if hoping to feel one last surge of that iconic energy. Others prayed. One young man knelt in a red and yellow hoodie, whispering quietly, "You were my father figure when I didn't have one." Inside the home, Brooke and Nick remained mostly out of the spotlight, choosing instead to grieve in silence. But close friends said the siblings were leaning on each other heavily. "They've been inseparable," one insider shared. "They cry, they laugh, they tell old stories, and then they cry again. It's a loop. But they're doing it together, and that's what he would have wanted." Meanwhile, the wrestling community debated how best to honor Hogan's legacy. WWE was already in talks for a week-long tribute called Hulkamania Lives On, with special programming planned across Raw, SmackDown, and NXT. Rumors circulated that WrestleMania would feature a 10-minute opening ceremony in his honor, including a hologram appearance and a massive video tribute narrated by John Cena. Internally, WWE staff and superstars were reeling. Backstage at Raw, Roman Reigns was reportedly seen in tears. He was the guy before there was even a blueprint for what the guy should be, Roman was overheard saying. "We all stand on his shoulders." Charlotte Flair posted an emotional tweet saying, "My dad lost a brother. And I lost one of the first people who told me I could make it in this business, not just as Ric Flair's daughter, but as me." Seth Rollins, always the voice of passion and rebellion, posted a single sentence that echoed across the internet. He made it okay to be larger than life. The company's corporate division reportedly considered renaming their Hall of Fame building in Hogan's honor. But it wasn't about buildings or banners anymore. The legacy was already written. What mattered now was how people remembered him, not the scandals, not the controversies, but the courage it took to rise, fall, and rise again. At a private gathering days after the funeral, a few close friends of Hogan's met at a beach near his Clearwater home. It wasn't an official memorial. No cameras. No speeches. Just a group of people who loved him. Jimmy Hart, Brutus Beefcake, Kevin Nash, and a few others brought folding chairs, cigars, and old photo albums. They passed them around like sacred relics. One showed Hogan playing guitar at a barbecue. Another captured him holding Brooke in his arms after her school recital, dressed in full Hulkamania gear because he had rushed there straight from a show. As the tide rolled in, Jimmy Hart stood up and pulled out a small boombox. He hit play, and the soft hum of Real American drifted into the salty night air. The others stood with him, cigars held to their hearts. Kevin Nash muttered, "Damn, I thought I'd be tougher than this." And then they raised a toast to Terry, to Hogan, to the immortal, but it wasn't all tears. WWE creative team members revealed that Hogan had secretly been helping mentor younger talent over Zoom calls during the last few years. He didn't want people to know, one producer said. But every Tuesday night, he was on a call with 2 or 3 NXT rookies, telling them how to find their character, how to connect with the crowd, how to walk that fine line between performer and person. He gave them gold and never asked for credit. There's also talk that Hogan had recorded one final message before his passing, a video meant to be aired only after his death. While it hasn't been released to the public yet, sources say it's heartfelt, raw, and filled with gratitude. He tells the fans thank you. He tells the haters thank you. He talks about the mistakes, the comebacks, the love he found in being a dad. "It's powerful," said someone who previewed the video. "It's not Hulk Hogan talking. It's Terry Bollea. And it might be the most human thing he's ever done." Indeed, that duality, between the superhero persona and the flawed man beneath, was what made his story so powerful. Hulk Hogan was a myth, an icon, a marketing machine. But Terry Bollea? He was a man who lived through highs and lows that most couldn't imagine. He battled fame. He battled addiction. He battled illness. And somehow, through it all, he kept showing up, if not always for the world, then for his children, his fans, and his peers. And now, the world is left to carry the torch. Every little kid who flexes in the mirror. Every veteran who remembers being backstage when Hogan lit up the room. Every fan who chants his name when the cameras aren't rolling, because some legacies don't need spotlights to live on, some echoes are too loud to ever fade, and somewhere, in the hearts of millions, a voice still roars, "Say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and believe in yourself." That was the gospel of Hulkamania, and now, it's our responsibility to keep it alive. In the weeks that followed Hulk Hogan's passing, it became clear that the world was grappling not just with the loss of a wrestling legend, but with the end of something deeply personal, almost sacred, for millions of fans around the globe. Tributes transitioned from sorrowful mourning to something more reflective and quietly celebratory. Wrestling schools began dedicating matches to his memory. Charities Hogan had supported over the years, many of which the public had never heard of, started sharing stories of quiet generosity. A children's hospital in Tampa revealed that for over a decade, Hogan had anonymously funded surgeries for young patients whose families couldn't afford care. The myth was being peeled back, layer by layer. And what remained underneath wasn't tarnished, it was more human, and somehow more meaningful. A particularly moving tribute came from a retired ring technician who worked with Hogan during the mid-90s. In a heartfelt blog post that quickly went viral, he wrote, "He didn't always get everything right. But he never made me feel small. He shook my hand before every show, looked me in the eye, called me brother like I mattered." When you're setting up the ring at 3 a.m., that stuff stays with you. Another unexpected voice emerged, Shawn Michaels. The Heartbreak Kid, known for his complicated past with Hogan, posted a black-and-white photo of them from their infamous SummerSlam match with a simple caption, "Time heals. Respect remains." The wrestling community was stunned. But more than that, they were moved. It reminded fans that the stories they watched unfold on screen were sometimes real, sometimes messy, and often filled with genuine passion, rivalry, and redemption. WWE soon announced that Hogan would be posthumously honored with a Lifetime Legacy ceremony during the upcoming WrestleMania weekend. But this wouldn't be like any Hall of Fame event before it. For the first time in history, the entire second hour of the ceremony would be devoted solely to the life and career of one man. Not just Hulk Hogan the performer, but Terry Bollea, the man, the myth, the mirror. Plans included a live musical tribute from Metallica, one of Hogan's favorite bands, and a speech from none other than Vince McMahon, who had come out of retirement to personally oversee the production. In an internal memo, McMahon reportedly wrote, "This company doesn't exist in its current form without Terry. Neither do I. This will be the most important show of my life." Backstage at WWE, there was a noticeable shift. The locker room, usually divided by generations, egos, and TV time, had become more unified. Roman Reigns began referring to Hogan as the original tribal chief. Becky Lynch brought Brooke Bollea onto her podcast, where the two spoke openly about loss, legacy, and the complicated relationship between fame and family. And then came the fans. Thousands of letters flooded WWE headquarters. Some were addressed to Hulk, others to Terry. Many came from people who had grown up in broken homes, or struggled through bullying, or battled illness, and in their darkest moments, found comfort in the image of a larger-than-life hero who screamed at them through the TV to believe in themselves. A mother from Detroit wrote, "My son was diagnosed with leukemia at 8. He was tired, scared, and wouldn't eat. But when I showed him an old Hogan match, everything changed. He started flexing again, eating his vitamins, telling his cancer to get ready for the leg drop. That was because of your dad, Brooke. Thank you for sharing him with us." And perhaps that was the most sobering truth of all. Hulk Hogan hadn't just entertained. He had saved people. Not with his hands, but with hope. Meanwhile, Nick Bollea began quietly working on a documentary project titled Behind the Bandana, the real story of Hulk Hogan, said to include never-before-seen home videos, interviews with family members, and letters Hogan wrote to himself during his darkest moments. Insiders say the film won't shy away from the controversies, but will contextualize them, showing a man who struggled under the weight of fame and who spent his final years trying to be better than his mistakes. He knew he'd been both a hero and a villain, said a producer on the project. And by the end of his life, I think he'd finally made peace with both. The final episode of Monday Night Raw before WrestleMania featured one of the most powerful segments in WWE history. The lights dimmed, and on the Jumbotron played a slow-motion montage of Hogan's greatest moments. From his iconic stare-down with Andre the Giant to his epic battles with The Rock. But more poignant were the off-screen moments, him walking backstage with blood on his face, laughing with fans, hugging a crying child, standing alone in the shadows after the show. The crowd didn't chant. They didn't cheer. They stood in silence, in respect. Then the bell tolled 10 times, and at the very end, his voice echoed throughout the arena. Recorded years ago, during a backstage promo that was never aired, "If I leave this world tomorrow, I hope people remember that I tried, that I fought, that I loved being part of their lives, and that even though I was never perfect, I never stopped believing in the good, in the power of people, and in the fight, brother. Always the fight." Tears flowed freely. Not just in the arena, but across the world. Because in that moment, the myth faded. And what remained was real. A man. A father. A fighter. A legacy. Terry Bollea may have been laid to rest, but Hulkamania? It's immortal. It lives in every wrestler who dreams of walking that ramp one day. It lives in every fan who finds strength in a character who screamed louder than life. And it lives in the stories, the tributes, the tears, and the silence that followed the end of a thunderous roar. Hulk Hogan is gone, but somewhere, on a quiet Florida breeze, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. What ya gonna do? When the memory of Hulk Hogan runs wild on